On the evening of June 24, 2024, in the city of Fort Myers, a tense situation unfolded that kept everyone who witnessed it on edge. A woman, drunk to the point of slurring her words, insisted she was sober enough to drive. However, when she sped through a zone where the limit was 40 miles per hour at 59 miles per hour, a traffic officer could not let it slide. What would happen in this tense standoff between a stubborn mother and a tough officer? Would she be able to convince the officer, or would she end up digging herself into an even worse situation? Stay tuned to find out the unexpected twists this incident brought. Perhaps no one is as innocently honest as this woman. She truly embodies the ideal of those who believe honesty is the most valuable virtue, but the reality here raises the question: is honesty always the path to salvation? When stopped for speeding, instead of bending the rules like others, she immediately opened up, admitted her violation, and, don't forget, revealed that she didn't even have a driver's license. But the peak of her naivete was not only admitting the speeding but also adding the detail that her license had been revoked beforehand, an unnecessary bit of information no one asked for, yet she generously shared. If honesty is a noble virtue, she would surely be the most virtuous woman on the planet, though unfortunately, this virtue does nothing to help when you're trying to salvage an already disastrous situation. Her full confession, leaving no detail hidden, truly deserves admiration, because if there were a contest for honesty without thinking, she would be the undisputed champion. But the story doesn't end with this unrestrained honesty. Her self-reporting of 2 major violations, so innocently and naturally, was no different from a thief calling the police to report their crime, along with a full confession. It's certainly a realistic way to handle the situation, but not very smart. She might have thought she was setting an example of integrity, but the outcome showed her to be a living testament to the saying, sometimes, silence and hiding the truth can be a much better strategy. This woman's portrait is both laughable and head-shaking. Every action seemed like it was taken from a comedy film, but unfortunately, this wasn't a scene in a movie, it was real life. When asked about the car, she explained seriously and persuasively, as if she were in a debate competition, that the car belonged to her mother, as if borrowing her parents' vehicle would exempt her from all laws. Surely, this must be an argument that will make lawmakers reconsider the law, right? If things were that simple, we could have a family-free traffic system. Just borrow your mother's car, and no laws could touch you. It's certainly an admirable strategy from a spirit perspective, but not very practical. What made the situation even more interesting and laughable was that she had previously been fined for driving with a revoked license. And yet, clearly, this didn't faze her. She seemed to think she was an exception, some traffic miracle who could break every rule without facing consequences. If there were a book called People Who Never Learn from Their Mistakes, she would surely be the main character, as she didn't just make mistakes once, but repeatedly, seemingly believing she would always escape the hand of justice. Maybe she thinks she's part of a special group, such as the lawbreakers who never get caught? Or perhaps she's silently aiming to break the record for most persistent traffic violator of the year, because if there were an award in this category, she would definitely win it with ease. And if this is how she's proving her filial piety, her mother must be wondering whether it's a compliment or a terrifying warning. Her mother might have thought she raised an obedient, law-abiding child, but now, with every fine for driving without a license, her mother might be wondering, is this her way of telling me something? Is this how my daughter shows love, by using my car to break all the rules I taught her? Or maybe she's planning to change her car's locks and hide all the documents to protect it from further violations. The officer didn't need to be a psychologist or even a seasoned mind reader to see that something was off with this woman. Just by looking at her staggering steps and the slurred speech she desperately tried to justify, it was clear that she was offering a free class on the symptoms of intoxication. From her confused gaze to the incomprehensible words, she was like a flashing neon sign reading, "Drunk here," more clearly than any traffic law signs. Instead of realizing she was in no condition to drive, she chose to respond in a bold manner and decided to refuse the sobriety test. Incredible! Instead of showing remorse, she used this moment to assert, "I definitely have something to hide." a move that basically slapped the officer in the face, saying, "Yes, I'm not just drunk, I have an interesting secret." And so, without needing to be Sherlock Holmes or anyone with special deduction skills, the officer easily categorized her as uncooperative and made the final decision. The golden ticket didn't lead to heaven, but straight to jail. With the proud titles of DUI, driving under the influence, and driving without a license, she truly had the chance to make her mark on the list of persistent traffic violators. She tried to innovate this list in the best way possible. Perhaps next time, she should consider walking instead of driving, or simply stay home and read a book on traffic laws. She might discover that there are some things that cannot always be denied, especially when they are obvious truths. The conversation between the police officer and the woman truly resembles an endless comedy skit, where unexpected developments follow one after another, leaving any potential audience shaking their heads in disbelief. When warned that continuing her lack of cooperation would only make things worse, she naturally did the exact opposite. Instead of heeding the officer's advice, she acted like a child throwing a tantrum, adding fuel to the already blazing fire. This situation is like a child who, after being scolded for breaking a toy, not only continues to destroy things but actively seeks out more to break. There are indeed people who never know when to stop. What makes this conversation particularly remarkable is that she didn't just refuse to cooperate, but boldly declared she was being unfairly targeted, as though driving without a license and showing signs of intoxication was a perfectly normal thing everyone does. Her argument was so absurd it could make lawyers in a courtroom stand up and applaud for her creativity. She wasn't just a traffic violator. She was a pioneer in inventing reasons to justify every wrong move. Did she think she was participating in a competition for the most unexpected traffic violation? If so, she'd certainly score high. The climax of this incredulity came when she insisted on refusing a search of the car she had so firmly claimed was her mother's, not hers. This is where logic, if it could be called logic, was completely thrown out the window. The confusion between car ownership and the right to refuse a search would surely make any judge laugh when reading the incident report. Imagine a judge reading this report, removing his glasses to wipe the sweat off his brow, unable to believe the woman's creativity in coming up with excuses to defy every rule. He'd probably think, if she can create logic like this, I might need to redo all the law courses I've taken throughout my life. Truly, this wasn't just a conversation between a police officer and a traffic violator, but a top-notch comedy performance, where every sentence from this woman made us question, am I living in a comedy movie? By now, this woman had truly reached the pinnacle of the art of making everything more complicated, and not in the positive way we often think of in success stories. When asked to perform a sobriety test, instead of humbling herself or trying to convince the officer of her sobriety, she immediately invoked a legal strategy that could be called impressively bold, invoking the Fifth Amendment. This might be a good tactic in other situations, but it wasn't much use when you're stumbling around like a boat without a rudder, and your words are so jumbled it's hard to tell what story you're telling. She might have thought invoking the Fifth would confuse the officer, but in reality, it only clarified that she wasn't just physically intoxicated, but also intellectually intoxicated. Instead of holding her ground and trying to prove she wasn't drunk, she chose an option no one would have expected: complete silence, with an air of confidence. She didn't just stay quiet, but acted as if refusing to do something was an act of power, like sitting at the top of a legal mountain. However, in the eyes of the officer, this wasn't a clever misdirection, but a grand self-sabotage performance that made anyone witnessing it think, well, that's the end of this. If that was how she hoped to impress judges, she might want to start over with a book on defense strategies. Her silence, rather than confusing the officer, turned the entire situation into a joke for the police team. Surely, after writing up the report, the officer shared the story with his colleagues, and it wouldn't be surprising if the whole team gathered that evening, instead of continuing patrols, to recount the scene to each other with laughter echoing throughout the station. This wasn't a smart use of the right to remain silent. It was a lesson for all of us that not every legal tactic is suitable for every situation, especially when you're in a scenario where self-defense is impossible. And anyway, If there were an award for most spectacular self-destruction, she would definitely win, no contest. With his sharp community protection instincts and high sense of professional duty, the officer tried to convince the woman that allowing her to keep driving was like opening the door for a traffic accident parade. Even though her impressive traffic record was enough to send a chill down anyone's spine, the officer patiently explained the danger of letting someone like her drive. But in response to the officer's intervention, the woman didn't just simply protest. She did something few would expect. She pulled out a high-stakes emotional card. "I need to pick up my child," she exclaimed urgently, as if she were playing the role of a devoted mother in a Hollywood movie. It was indeed a touching tactic, had this mother not just been arrested for driving drunk without a license. In that moment, she probably thought she'd created a strong enough reason to make the officer hesitate, but the truth was far from what she expected. Of course, the officer couldn't ignore such a reason. A child, even when justified by the sweetest words, could not be a legitimate reason for such serious traffic violations. So began the discussion about picking up the child, as if the officer had been drawn into a heartwarming drama where, in the end, no one found anything heartwarming about it. Who could agree that letting a mother, one who had just escaped the grip of alcohol and didn't have a license, be responsible for picking up a child was a wise decision? To ensure the child's safety, it was best to make sure she didn't get in the car again, and to find a safer way to fulfill the task. If given a choice between picking up the child in an intoxicated state or taking a taxi, surely the taxi would be the much wiser choice. Maybe next time, when such a minor journey becomes part of an unconvincing excuse, she should consider taking a taxi. Because if not, next time, she'll not only be picking up the child but also facing an entire collection of ridiculous excuses, and a lesson in not using a child as a shield for her poor decisions. With admirable patience and undeniable professionalism, the officer politely reminded the woman of another small issue she might have overlooked. If she brings prohibited items into jail, she'll face a new series of charges. What seemed like a gentle warning was actually a subtle reminder that her current list of crimes was long enough to fill a book, and if she wasn't careful, it would only get longer. However, instead of showing any fear or remorse, the woman immediately countered, as if this was her chance to join an international debate competition. She not only denied what the officer had just said, but also made things more complicated by arguing about things she didn't even have, such as illegal items. It was a brilliant display of her natural argumentative abilities, especially when she had no reasonable justification for carrying prohibited items. It was as if she were participating in a massive intellectual battle, but choosing to compete against a non-existent opponent. If there were an award for turning a bad situation into an immediate disaster, she would undoubtedly be a strong contender, maybe even a guaranteed winner. For the officer, this evening must have felt like an endless series of exhausting moments. Rather than being able to perform his duties smoothly, he was faced with someone who not only broke the law but was deliberately complicating everything further with unfounded arguments. As for the woman, this evening was likely a strange emotional roller coaster. She probably didn't even realize what she had just done. In her mind, perhaps what had just occurred wasn't a big deal. After all, she had no reason to stop, even when everyone around her fully recognized that she had just created a new charge for herself. In conclusion, it was an emotional evening not only for the officer but also for the woman, but definitely a night neither side would easily forget. She might learn that sometimes, when you're in too deep, the best move is not to dig yourself deeper into the hole. The officer in this situation can be seen as the epitome of calm and professionalism, a man who seemed capable of handling any tense situation without ever losing his composure, like a solid wall facing the crashing waves. Meanwhile, the woman acted like a storm unleashing her fury on those around her, especially the officer. Every word she uttered was filled with indignation, as if the whole world was wronging her and violating the rights of an innocent citizen. She screamed about the injustice as if she were standing before a court, despite the only evidence against her being her unjustifiable actions: drunk driving, no driver's license, and a long list of acts of resistance. If there were a guidebook on how to get arrested in 5 minutes, she would certainly be its sole author. And even though she stubbornly claimed her innocence with no evidence to counter the clearly evident charges, the officer remained incredibly patient, as if he were caring for a child sulking over not getting a cookie. Instead of responding angrily or arguing, he continued doing his job with admirable calmness, not letting baseless complaints distract him. This was truly a textbook example of how to maintain composure when faced with a professional troublemaker. What's most commendable was that the officer still kept a polite smile and didn't forget the reason he was there, to protect the community from dangerous drivers. He wasn't just rescuing in the literal sense, but enduring all sorts of resistance and illogical reasoning, yet never letting his personal emotions interfere with his duties. It wasn't an easy job, but he handled it with patience, as if he were teaching someone how to behave reasonably. While the officer represented professionalism, the woman exemplified that not everyone understands that sometimes silence and cooperation are smarter strategies than confronting everything head-on. She might not have realized that with every illogical defense, she was only making the situation more tangled and increasing her own charges. As for the officer, he didn't need more words. His actions and calmness spoke for themselves. In the end, when everything was settled, this woman officially received a long list of charges: drunk driving, driving without a license, and even public disorderly conduct, a perfect trio for a special evening. Even though she didn't show any remorse or reduce her resistance, the officer maintained his professional demeanor, completing the report as if he were performing a regular office job. If there were a competition for performing duties without being affected by others, this officer would undoubtedly win first place. As for her, no matter how much she screamed, she could not deny that she had contributed significantly to her criminal record. From this incident, we can learn the importance of obeying the law and acting responsibly when participating in traffic. Even if you feel you're in the right or think a small violation won't hurt, the reality is different. Driving without a license or under the influence of alcohol is not only dangerous for yourself but for everyone around you. The officer's actions in this video are a lesson in patience and professionalism, even when faced with fierce resistance. Ultimately, responsibility and adherence to regulations are not only an individual's duty but a societal responsibility to ensure safety for all.